So imagine you are a small country. You're very proud, very important country, but you are little and you are not very rich. And you decide in your little country that it is time to put in streetlights. Right? You think we may not be a wealthy country, but gosh darn it, it is the 21st century, and in a bunch of our little towns and villages that want them, we're going to put in streetlights, or we're going to upgrade streetlights in places that need them to be fixed up. We're going to get funding, we'll get grants for streetlights, and we're going to do that all over the place in our country. Now, if you are a town that wants in on this project, if you want some streetlights for your town, what your government tells you is, okay, here's how you're going to do it. Your town, your village, if you want streetlights, what you have to do is you have to hire this particular company. And it's a consulting company, and that consulting company will assess your town's needs. And after they do an assessment in your town, they will basically attest to what kind of streetlights you need, and then those are the kind of streetlights you will get. That's the process. That's how we're getting streetlights in our country. And it turns out that as all the little towns all over the country start going through this process to get their streetlights, they all, as they are told to do, they all hire this one company, this one consulting firm to help them get their streetlights. And a couple of things pretty quickly emerge. First of all, that company, the company they're all told they have to use in order to get their streetlights, that company turns out to be owned by a guy who's in business with the Prime Minister's son-in-law. And the business he's in with the Prime Minister's son-in-law, the company they own together, turns out to be a company that makes streetlights. Huh! What a coincidence, right? So every little town all over your country has to hire this one company. And every single time, the guy who runs that company comes in, looks around and says, yes, I've looked at this very carefully. I've assessed your unique needs here in your town. And it turns out the only streetlights you should get, the only streetlights you can get, the streetlights, in fact, that you're going to get are the streetlights that are only sold by the company that is owned by the Prime Minister's son-in-law and also me. That is your only choice. You want streetlights, that's how you get them. And even though these guys had no streetlight expertise, even though their company was brand new, essentially set up just for this purpose, even though basically nobody else had ever bought streetlights from them before without being forced to do so, now, all of a sudden, boy, do they have a lot of business. Yeah, the Prime Minister's son-in-law turns out to be basically the sole supplier of streetlights to towns and villages all over the country. And as such, he is paid very handsomely for that in public funds. The country where this happened happens to be in Europe. And it turns out the funding for the streetlights came from the European Union, from the EU. When investigative reporters figured out that this scheme was happening with the streetlights, and when the EU investigated themselves, they realized this well-intentioned project, sort of small-scale project to put streetlights in this poor country, had instead become basically just a project to make the Prime Minister's son-in-law a millionaire. The company, of course, says they did nothing wrong, but the EU pulled their funding for that project. How did the Prime Minister react to that? He said, well, okay, I guess we can't do this with EU funds anymore. We'll just pay for it ourselves, our country. Out of our meager budget as one of the poorest countries in Europe, we'll pay for it. Which means the Prime Minister decided that he would just pay his son-in-law directly from government funds. And that is how Viktor Orban's son-in-law made his first millions. Since then, over the course of Viktor Orban's 16 years in power, Orban's son-in-law has become one of the wealthiest men in the whole country, worth hundreds of millions of dollars at least. One of the sectors he's in is streetlights. Another sector is that he owns lots of luxury hotels. I mentioned the EU, the European Union. The EU has a presidency that rotates from country to country every 6 months. When the EU presidency automatically rotated to Hungary, to Viktor Orban a couple years ago, What that meant in very practical terms is that there would be lots of official delegations from other European countries coming to Hungary all the time, coming to Budapest to do EU business, because Viktor Orban was the president of the EU for that 6-month period. What some of those other countries would soon find was that no matter what hotels they booked themselves into in Budapest for one of these official visits, the Orban government would somehow find a way to unbook them from the hotels they wanted to stay at, and instead they would find themselves magically rebooked into one of the hotels owned by Viktor Orban's son-in-law. They would make reservations at different hotels, and the Orban government would unbook them and put them in his son-in-law's hotels instead. That was uncovered by investigative reporting from Direct 36 and V-Square in Hungary. Viktor Orban's son-in-law has had a good time of it while his father-in-law has been in effectively dictatorial control of the country of Hungary. The FT reported last year that he nearly doubled his net worth to almost 500 million euros just in the previous year alone. Nice. But ahead of the elections yesterday in Hungary, which saw that young man's father-in-law turfed out of power after 16 years and potentially now facing prosecution for corruption and theft of public assets. Ahead of yesterday's election in Hungary, Orban's son-in-law left the country. He left Hungary and reportedly relocated to the friendlier environs of the United States. And forgive me, I am terrible with Hungarian names, so I don't know exactly how to pronounce the son-in-law's name. You can see it there. It's spelled Istvan Tiborcz. I don't know exactly how you say that name, but I think that it's pronounced Jared. I think that's not true, but that is one way to pronounce it. Istvan, Jared. Trumpism in the United States is not just a purely personal thing. Trumpism in the United States is not just a big political manifestation of the quirky authoritarian personality of Donald Trump the man. I mean, it may be that for Trump himself, but in terms of power, in terms of governance, in terms of why all these other people on the American far right like Trump in power and what they want to do with Trump in power, it's not just based on Trump's personality. It's actually based on a model. More than anything else, it is based on the model of Viktor Orban in Hungary. Remember Project 2025? The Heritage Foundation created Project 2025 to plan out what exactly the Trump administration would do once they got into power, and the Trump administration has followed that blueprint very tightly. The head of the Heritage Foundation says outright that in looking for a model for how conservatives should approach power and government, he said Viktor Orban is not a model of how to do that. He says Viktor Orban is the model for how to do that. Strongman authoritarians like Orban and like Trump, their ongoing rule is not inevitable. It is not a fate that our countries cannot escape from. These guys are not permanently in power. They are not in power for life. As the disciplined, nonviolent, big tent, sustainable, growing resistance to Orban started to coalesce, as Orban started to look like he was going to lose, his supposedly unbreakable base of support just collapsed. The guy who just beat him is a former member of his own party. Nobody actually likes a corrupt despot. They all just support him because they think he's going to be in power forever. So you need to stay on his right side in order to get anything for yourself. When it becomes clear that that's not true, that the despot is not going to be there forever, it always, everywhere, always falls apart. But while the President of the United States is in the state of mind that he is in, while he is posting pictures of himself online that portray himself as Jesus Christ, while at the same time he is attacking the Pope, while his actions have slowed the economy to such a crawl that in other countries, that same level of economic stagnation is cited as a reason that country just rose up and overthrew its authoritarian leadership. as Donald Trump is taking these increasingly wild and increasingly inexplicable military swings in the Middle East that really do make no sense, that appear to have no point, and that have left us with almost literally no allies in the entire world. As the president appears, bizarrely, to be trying, I guess, potentially to offload his vice president, because maybe that'll help. Amid all of this insanity, it may be a good time to remember that this kind of desperation from the White House and from the president is palpably driven by fear, by the expectation that voters, that the public, that the nation at large has turned against him and is doing so more and more every day, that the country is going to turf him and his party out on their ear, and quickly. I mean, the whole idea of these guys, Orban and Trump and all of them, the whole idea of them is to create a false sense of permanence, that they can never be ousted, that they will never leave, that resistance is futile, that you better line up with them because you'll never beat them. They're going to be here forever. Well, how's that going? Streetlights or no? The streets of Budapest, the streets of Hungary last night were lit up to the stratosphere with pure joy, lit up like a beacon with the proof that the people can fix problems like this, like Viktor Orban and like Donald Trump, and that no would-be strongman can stop it anywhere, no matter what.